The most expensive private home ever built in America sat empty on the coast of Florida, and nobody wanted it. Buyers walked away. The state of Florida took a pass, and so did the government of the United States, which had been handed the whole estate for free. 126 rooms, 17 acres of oceanfront in Palm Beach, built by the richest woman in the country at the very height of her fortune. When she died and left it to the nation as a gift, the nation looked at the bill and gave it back. Her name was Marjorie Merriweather Post, and the house was called Mar-a-Lago. It cost around $7 million to build in the 1920s, which is well over $100 million in today's money, and she meant for it to become a winter White House, a place where presidents would host the world. Instead, it became the single most famous piece of real estate that money could not give away. By the time the government was done with it, the estate was listed for sale at $20 million, and there were no takers. The town of Palm Beach approved a plan to knock it down and carve the land into building lots. The greatest house in America was about to become a row of empty parcels. This is a story about the kind of fortune almost none of us will ever inherit, and what happens to it anyway. Because Marjorie Post did not lose her money the way you might expect, she was never swindled, nor did she gamble it away at a card table. She died one of the wealthiest women in America, with her name still on grocery shelves in every kitchen in the country. So how does someone that rich end up with a palace nobody will take even when the price is nothing at all? The answer is the same reason most great fortunes vanish without anyone noticing, and it almost never announces itself until it has already happened. Half a century before that demolition plan, Marjorie Merriweather Post was not a woman anyone felt sorry for. She was a young girl in Battle Creek, Michigan, sitting in on her father's business meetings, watching a fortune get built by the man who was building one. Her father was Charles William Post, and in 1895, he started a small company selling a coffee substitute made from roasted grain. He called it Postum. Battle Creek at the time was the strange capital of America's health food craze, a town full of sanitariums and cereal experiments, and Post threw himself into the middle of it. Plenty of people thought his product was a strange idea, a hot drink with no coffee in it, sold to Americans who loved their coffee. But Post was a marketer ahead of his time, and Postium sold. Then came a cereal called Grape Nuts. Then Post Toasties. Within a decade, the Postum cereal company was one of the great success stories of American food, run out of a town that would soon call itself the cereal capital of the world. Marjorie grew up inside that rise. Her father brought her into the business when she was still a child, walked her through the factory floor, taught her how the money moved and where it came from. She was, by every account, the sharpest student he could have asked for. And then, in 1914, C.W. Post died, and everything he had built landed on the shoulders of a 27-year-old woman. She inherited around $20 million. In the money of 1914, that was a staggering sum, the equal of something close to $500 million now. At 27, Marjorie Merriweather Post was one of the richest people in the United States, and one of the very few of them who was a woman. This was an era when women in America could not yet vote, could not hold a seat on most corporate boards, could not always sign their own contracts without a husband's name beside theirs. And here was Marjorie, holding the reins of a national company outright. Her biographer, Nancy Rubin Stewart, would later title the definitive account of her life, American Empress, and the title fit. Here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. She did not sit back and collect the dividends, she grew the thing, and she did it across a personal life that turned over 4 times because Marjorie married 4 husbands, and each marriage was, in its own way, a chapter of the fortune. The first, to a Greenwich investment banker named Edward Close, came before the money and gave her 2 daughters. The second is the one that built the empire. Her third took her onto the world stage. The fourth was a late companion, but it was that second marriage that mattered most to the money. Her second husband was a Wall Street financier named Edward Francis Hutton, the man whose name would sit atop one of the most famous brokerage houses in the country. Together they went on a buying spree. Jello Baker's chocolate, Maxwell House coffee, of all things, folded in beside the coffee substitute her father had built the company to replace. In 1929, they reorganized the whole enterprise under a new name, a name that would sit in American pantries for the rest of the century: General Foods. That same year, they made the bet that turned a cereal company into a giant. A rugged inventor named Clarence Birdseye had figured out how to flash freeze food so it still tasted fresh when it thawed. Nobody had cracked frozen food at scale before. Marjorie, the story goes, tasted a frozen goose that Birdseye had prepared and understood at once what she was looking at. General Foods bought the frozen food operation for around $22 million, and with it, invented the modern frozen food aisle. The company Marjorie inherited as a breakfast brand now reached into dinner, dessert, and the freezer. She was, by the middle of the century, often called the wealthiest woman in America, and she was far more than a businesswoman. In Washington, she became the great hostess of her age, a woman some called the Queen of Washington, whose invitations were said to rank just below an invitation to the White House itself. She threw legendary square dances and galas. Fortunes went out the door to charity, funding a field hospital for the American Red Cross in the First World War, paying for Salvation Army feeding stations during the Depression, backing the National Symphony, and helping bring the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts into being. Her generosity ran on a scale almost no private citizen could match. So, she did what the very rich have always done with a fortune this large. She built monuments to it. And this is where the seeds of the whole collapse were planted, though nobody watching her lay marble would have believed it. Because everything Marjorie Post built was breathtaking, and almost none of it was built to pay for itself. Start with the crown jewel. In the mid-1920s, on that strip of Palm Beach where the Atlantic meets a saltwater lagoon, she commissioned Mar-a-Lago. The name means sea to lake. She hired the society architect Marion Sims Wyeth and the Viennese stage designer Joseph Urban, and told them, in effect, to spare nothing. They brought in Doria limestone from Genoa, shipped across the ocean in boatloads. They stripped tiles and marble from an old Cuban castle. When it was done, Mar-a-Lago had 126 rooms across more than 60,000 square feet, a great gilded hall, cloisters, a golf course, and a tower you could see the whole island from. It was, and it remains, one of the largest private homes ever built in the United States. The construction alone took 3 years, and he had hundreds of craftsmen. Joseph Urban, who had designed sets for the Ziegfeld Follies and the Metropolitan Opera, treated the whole house like a stage set, gilding a ballroom ceiling and covering the walls in the kind of ornament you would expect in a European court. Marjorie wanted a home that could stand beside anything the old dynasties of Europe had built, and by the time the last tile was placed, she had it. Some 1,500 workers had a hand in it. What she did not have, and what nobody thinks about while the scaffolding is still up, was any way for a house on that scale to earn back a fraction of what it swallowed. It was a masterpiece and a money pit in the same set of blueprints. Mar-a-Lago was only the beginning of the empire of monuments. In Washington, she kept a grand estate called Hillwood, filled with French and Russian art. Up in the Adirondacks, she owned Camp Topridge, a wilderness retreat of some 300 acres with dozens of buildings and its own Russian-style lodge, where guests were flown in to rough it in absolute luxury. And on the water, she owned the Sea Cloud, the largest private sailing yacht in the world at the time, a 4-masted ship with a crew of dozens and staterooms, trimmed like a European palace. Now, Marjorie could afford to build all of this without blinking. What almost nobody said out loud was what it would cost to keep, year after year, long after the woman who loved it was gone. There is one more monument to add, and it is the strangest of all because it ties Marjorie Post to a fallen dynasty far older and far bloodier than her own. In 1937, her third husband, a lawyer named Joseph Davies, was appointed United States ambassador to the Soviet Union. Marjorie went with him to Moscow, and she arrived at an extraordinary moment. The Soviet government was broke, desperate for hard currency to fund its factories and its army, and it was doing something almost unthinkable. It was selling off the treasures it had seized from the murdered Russian Imperial family, the Romanovs, whose entire dynasty had been wiped out in the revolution 20 years before. The crown jewels of a slaughtered royal house were being sold cheap to pay for tractors. And Marjorie Merriweather Post, the serial heiress from Battle Creek, was standing right there with the money to buy. She acquired Russian Imperial porcelain, icons, silver, and close to 90 objects by the court jeweler Topridge, among them 2 of the famous Imperial Easter eggs, including the jeweled egg made for Catherine the Great. To this day, her collection at Hillwood is the finest assembly of Russian imperial art anywhere outside of Russia itself. The sales ran through the Soviet trade agencies, which treated the icons and chalices of the old regime as inventory to be moved. Marjorie kept buying. Gold and enamel, imperial portraits, a diamond crown said to have been worn by one of the last czarinas of Russia. Objects that had once sat inside the Winter Palace crossed the ocean and settled into the display cases of an American heiress from a cereal town. She was, in plain terms, shopping the estate sale of a murdered dynasty, and she got the finest pieces at fire sale prices. Her biographer Nancy Rubin Stewart, and the curators who run her collection now, have filled whole books cataloging what she carried home. Here is a myth worth clearing up along the way, because you will hear it repeated. People say Marjorie Post dined with Stalin. She did not. It was her husband, the ambassador, who dealt with the Soviet leadership. Marjorie's part in Moscow was the collecting, the quiet transfer of a dead dynasty's crown jewels into an American heiress's hands. That part is true, and it matters because it is the whole story in miniature. Because here is the mechanism, the quiet thing underneath all of these beautiful objects. A monument does not make money. Mansions earn nothing. A yacht pays no dividends, and a case of Topridge eggs sits behind glass and does nothing but demand insurance, guards, and climate control. When you pour a fortune into things like these, you are not storing your wealth. You are converting it into something that costs money to own, every single day, forever. There is an old phrase for this kind of possession: a white elephant. The term comes from a story about the kings of old Siam who would hand a rare white elephant to a courtier they wanted to ruin. The animal was sacred, so you could not put it to work, and you could not give it away or harm it. You had to feed it and house it and care for it until the cost drained you dry. A gift that was a curse in disguise, dressed up as an honor. Mar-a-Lago was a white elephant the size of a city block. Running that estate cost something close to $1 million a year in the money of the 1970s, just to keep the lights on and the roof intact. It took a small army of gardeners to hold the Florida jungle back from the grounds. Nothing about it generated a dime of income. It was pure, glorious, ruinous cost. And Marjorie could carry that cost with ease, because she had an enormous river of money still flowing from General Foods. But a fortune is a living thing. It flows down to the people who inherit it, and it splits and it thins. The question that hangs over every great fortune is not whether the founder can afford the monuments, it is whether anyone after them can. And Marjorie Post, for all her brilliance, made the one decision that guaranteed the answer would be no. She decided to give the monuments away. Ask yourself something here before we go on. If someone handed you a palace for free, 126 rooms on the ocean, would you take it? Hold that thought, because almost everyone offered this one said no, and the reasons are the whole point of the story. Marjorie was a genuine patriot, and as she grew older, she began to think about legacy in the grandest possible terms. She did not want Mar-a-Lago to become just another rich family's beach house after she was gone. Her wish was for it to serve the country. So in her will, she left Mar-a-Lago to the United States government. The idea was beautiful on paper. The estate would become a winter White House, a place where American presidents could receive kings and prime ministers against the backdrop of the sea, a permanent symbol of the nation's welcome. She died in 1973, and she handed her greatest creation to the American people. And the American people, once they saw what it cost, did not want it. The problem was the one nobody had solved. A gift of a building is not a gift if it comes with a bill the recipient cannot pay. The federal government looked at Mar-a-Lago and saw close to $1 million a year in upkeep with no way to earn it back. Officials saw a security nightmare too. An enormous open estate with a long shoreline sitting right under the flight path of the Palm Beach airport, with planes roaring over the roof every few minutes. President after president took one look and preferred to vacation somewhere simpler. The winter White House hosted no one. It sat there, magnificent and empty, draining money out of the treasury for a purpose it never once served. Then the same thing happened to her second great gift, and the timing of it was almost too perfect. Marjorie had also left her Washington estate, Hillwood, with all its Russian and French treasures, to the Smithsonian Institution, along with an endowment to help run it. The Smithsonian accepted. Then it did the math. The money she had left behind did not cover what the estate cost to operate, and in 1976, the Smithsonian's governing board voted to give Hillwood back to her foundation. The nation's own museum looked at Marjorie Post's gift and returned it. Then came the third. Camp Topridge, the wilderness retreat in the Adirondacks, she left to the state of New York. The state held on to the wild land and folded most of the acreage into its forest preserve. But the buildings, the lodges, the Russian dacha in the pines, all of that was pure cost. So the state sold the developed heart of Camp Topridge to a private buyer for around $900,000, a fraction of what it would take to build, and washed its hands of the upkeep. There was even the yacht to deal with. The Sea Cloud, that four-masted marvel, had left the family years before, sold off in the 1950s to Rafael Trujillo, the dictator of the Dominican Republic. The greatest private sailing ship in the world ended up as a strongman's toy, and today it carries paying tourists as a cruise ship. Even that monument outlived the fortune's willingness to keep feeding it. One by one, the treasures Marjorie Post had built to last forever were handed back or sold off, not because they were not beautiful, but because beauty does not pay a heating bill. And Mar-a-Lago, the greatest of them all, had the hardest fall. After the government returned it to her foundation around 1980, by an act of Congress that handed the estate back, Mar-a-Lago went on the market, and it sat. The asking price was $20 million, and buyer after buyer walked away because whoever bought it would inherit the exact same white elephant that had scared off the United States government. 3 separate deals fell apart. The house was so unwanted that the town of Palm Beach approved a plan to demolish it and subdivide the oceanfront into ordinary building lots. The most expensive home in America, the palace of imported limestone and gilded ceilings, came within a signature of the wrecking ball. In the mid-1980s, it sold at last for around $10 million, a fraction of what Marjorie had spent to build it half a century before and half the asking price. The crown jewel of one of the great American fortunes changed hands for less than the value of the land and the stone underneath it. That is what a white elephant is worth in the end. Not what you paid for it, whatever someone will take to relieve you of the burden. So the palace survived in the hands of others. But the question we started with is still sitting there. How does a woman this rich end up with monuments the country will not accept as gifts? To answer that, you have to follow the money itself, not the buildings. And the money tells a quieter, more important story. Here is the part people get wrong about Marjorie Post. She did not die broke. Not even close. When she passed in 1973, her worth still sat somewhere around $200 million, which is close to $1.5 billion in today's money. By any normal measure, the fortune was intact. She won. She stayed rich to the very end and gave fortunes away to the Red Cross, to the Boy Scouts, to the symphony, and to the arts. The collapse was never in the size of the fortune. It was in its shape. Because a fortune spent on monuments and then split among heirs does something very different from a fortune kept together and put to work. Marjorie's money, at her death, went in 3 directions to her 3 daughters, along with her foundations and her charities. Those daughters included Adelaide and Eleanor from her first marriage, and Nadenia from her marriage to Hutton, a young woman the world would come to know as the Hollywood actress Dina Merrill. 3 heirs, 3 shares, and that was the beginning of the thinning. Watch what happened just 1 generation down. Her daughter Eleanor died years later, leaving an estate of around $74 million, itself a great deal of money. But that estate did not pass to anyone in one piece. It dissolved into a tangle of competing claims and lawsuits that stretched across Washington, Baltimore, New York, Paris, and Switzerland, with lawyers and tax collectors carving off a slice from every direction. The money did not compound, it scattered, and a great deal of it evaporated into fees and taxes and the friction of being fought over. That is the pattern. Split, split again, tax, fee, sell the thing that costs too much to keep. The founder's mountain of money becomes a range of hills, then a scatter of stones. There is even an old proverb for it, the one they say applies to nearly every great fortune. From shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The first builds it, the second enjoys it, the third is back where the family started. And the one thing that could have broken that curse, Marjorie never built. She never built a machine to hold the fortune together. Think about what she owned at the end. Palaces, art, a yacht, jewels. Beautiful, static things that only take money to keep. What she did not own, by the end, was control of the company. Her stake in General Foods had thinned and spread across the decades as the business grew and changed hands, and she stepped down from its board in the late 1950s. The family did not run the company anymore. So when General Foods was sold to Philip Morris in 1985 for around $5.5 billion, understand what that number means. That was the price the corporation fetched on the open market 12 years after Marjorie died, paid out to public shareholders. It was not the family's money. The Posts did not collect $5 billion. By then, the family and the company that carried its name had long since gone their separate ways. That is the whole story in one line. She built the most valuable things in America and kept the least valuable kind of wealth. She kept the monuments and let go of the engine. Now, if the story ended there, it would be a sad little tale about a rich woman and some expensive houses, but it is more useful than that because right in the same era, other families faced the exact same trap, the exact same white elephant, and beat it. And the difference between them is the whole lesson. Go up into the mountains of North Carolina to a house that makes even Mar-a-Lago look modest. Biltmore, the 250-room chateau the Vanderbilts built in the 1890s, the largest private home in America to this day. By the middle of the 20th century, Biltmore was caught in the same trap as Mar-a-Lago. It was a white elephant bleeding money. By 1960, the estate was losing $250,000 a year, and the family could have done what Marjorie's heirs did, hand it to the government, sell it off, or let it fall down. Instead, a Vanderbilt grandson named William Cecil came home and made a decision that changed everything. He refused to treat Biltmore as a monument. To him, it was a business, and it would earn its keep or it would not stand. The work was slow, and it was humbling. In 1968, after years of grinding, Biltmore turned its first annual profit. Do you know how much it was? $16.34. Not 16,000, not 16 million, but $16. For a house that size, that was either the most pathetic profit in American history or the most important, depending on whether you grasped what it proved. It proved the thing could stand on its own 2 feet, and it grew from there. In 1985, the very same year that Mar-a-Lago was being sold off for scrap, William Cecil opened a winery at Biltmore, completing his father's old dream of a self-sustaining estate. Today, Biltmore takes in more than $200 million a year, every dollar of it earned and put back into the place, with no government grants, no charity, and no rescue. The house is still standing, it is still in the family, all because someone built an engine underneath the monument instead of just admiring the monument. That is the machine Marjorie never built. And Biltmore is not the only example. Look at the DuPont family, who made a fortune in gunpowder and chemicals older than the Post fortune by a century. Back in 1915, the DuPonts did something Marjorie never did. They created a private holding company, a plain, unglamorous vehicle called Christiana Securities, whose entire purpose was to hold the family's controlling stake in the DuPont company all in one place, so it could not thin out and scatter across the heirs. It was boring, and it was brilliant. It kept close to a third of a giant company, locked in family hands for more than 60 years. When it was folded back into the main company in 1977, the fortune it had guarded was still enormous. Decades on, the DuPont wealth is still measured in the tens of billions, spread across some 3,500 living relatives and still holding together. The Rockefellers did the same thing with a different tool. They built family trusts in the 1930s and a private family office to manage the money as one body across generation after generation. The Standard Oil fortune has now passed through 6 generations and still holds together across dozens of heirs because it was never allowed to shatter into 100 separate inheritances the way Marjorie's did. Compare that to the Vanderbilts on the other side of the ledger, the family that built Biltmore in the first place, who went from the richest family in America to a reunion where, by some accounts, not a single Vanderbilt in the room was a millionaire. Same starting fortune, opposite ending. The difference was never the size of the pile. It was whether anyone built the machine. The idea behind all of these is the same, and it is not complicated. You keep the wealth in one working body instead of cutting it into slices. A holding company owns the shares so no single heir can sell them off. Meanwhile, a trust holds the assets and pays out only the income while the core stays whole. And a family office runs the money like a business, answerable to the whole family rather than to one spender in one generation. It is unglamorous work. Nobody builds a museum to a trust document, but that plain document is the thing that outlives the marble. The families who lasted did not build the biggest house. They built the boring machine underneath it, a holding company, a trust, or a house run like a business, something with an engine, something that earned, something that could carry its own weight into the next generation without anyone having to give it away. Marjorie Post built the most beautiful monuments in America and skipped the machine. And that, in the end, is the difference between a dynasty and a demolition permit. So think back to where we started. The most expensive home in America, sitting empty, listed for a fraction of its worth, one signature away from the bulldozer. It was not empty because Marjorie Post ran out of money. She had money to the end. The palace stood empty because she had built a thing that only knew how to cost and had left it to a country that finally did the math the way the smart families always do. What is this worth to keep? And the answer, for a monument with no engine, is almost always less than you think. The Gilded Age is full of these ghosts. The Vanderbilts alone built a row of marble palaces up Fifth Avenue in New York, monuments meant to announce a dynasty that would never end. By the 1940s, almost every one of them had been torn down and replaced with office towers, because even the Vanderbilts could not carry them. Right there in Palm Beach, the great mansions thrown up in the same boom as Mar-a-Lago earned the same nickname, White Elephants, and the wrecking crews took them down through the 50s and the 60s one after another. Palaces of the richest families in America gone, not to war or scandal, but to the plain grinding arithmetic of upkeep. Marjorie Merriweather Post was sharper than most, kinder than most, and richer than almost anyone alive. She gave away more than almost anyone will ever earn. And she still could not make her monuments outlive her, because beauty was never the thing that carries a fortune forward. The machine is... There is one small mercy in all of this. Hillwood, the Washington estate the Smithsonian handed back, did not vanish. Her foundation reopened it as a public museum, charging admission, running tours, paying its own way the way an institution has to. The one monument of hers that survived whole is the one that was, in the end, forced to earn its keep. Even her own legacy proves the rule. The treasure that lasted is the treasure that learned to carry itself, which raises a harder question, the one worth sitting with. If the richest woman in America could not keep her palace in the family, what chance does an ordinary inheritance have? And there is one more heiress whose story makes even this one look gentle. A woman who was called, in her own time, the richest girl in the world, who inherited younger than Marjorie did, with even more money, and who ended her life in a way that almost no fortune should have allowed. That story is next